All right. So, hello, everyone. My name is Mia. I work at Flipboard as the head of creator community, and I'm so thrilled to be here today to discuss building communities across the social web. I'm joined by Andy Piper, who is the head of communications and developer relations lead at Mastodon. He's come all the way from the UK, and you brought a little friend. Who's that?
So this is our mascot. For those of you that don't know, Mastodon has a mascot that looks a bit like this, a mastodon, made by an amazing Brazilian artist called Doppatu. And we had a plushie made that you could get on our store. It's very big. It's perfectly cuddleable. We did loads of testing. It's really, really good to cuddle. But it would have filled my suitcase, so I bought my little 3D printed version. So, yeah.
So pleased to have Rose Wang, who's the COO of Bluesky, as well as Leila Brillson, the CMO of the Onion. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Onion has the distinction of having the largest non-individual human following on Bluesky. Is that right?
I am pretty sure as of like Friday. I mean, there's like a numbers game kind of. We may even be in fourth place. We're like going neck and neck with Mark Hamill. But I'm pretty sure we've beaten the New York Times. So I think we're the only organization. But it's like Mark Hamill, AOC, and George Takei, and then us.
And of course, yeah. And Leila also has tons of experience building fandoms when she was at Netflix. And she's part of a writers collective called the Flaming Hydra that uses Mastodon as one of its central community channels. Yes. So tons of rich and varied community building experience. But since we started talking a little bit about followers, I'd like to start with a little bit of context setting so we can all get on the same page about what we mean when we say community, because I think we mean it's a lot more than just followers and audience. What do you think defines like a healthy community in 2025? Maybe we'll start with you, Leila, since you're so seeped in it.
Yes, I am seeped in it. I think community building on the internet and digital spaces is a huge passion of mine. And I think that there's a couple of things that define community. One is does it excite or ignite a part of your identity? I think communities are very identity focused. I think people understand their identity through their communities. Is it self-regulating? I think that's the difference between an audience and a community. I would also say, does it value authenticity and knowledge? Because I do think that communities generally in order to have a community that includes people, there's an element of exclusion, and usually great communities are based on just a depth of knowledge or passion.
And how have you seen decentralization impact the nature of community?
I mean, that's such an interesting question, and I think that's going to be a really difficult question because ultimately, we have been so adherent to platforms via communities, whereas I think decentralization is going to allow folks to bring their communities with them across platforms. But communities outside of platforms, that's kind of a new thing, right? Like we really are going to have to think that through.
Yeah, when we talked, you talked about building web rings that followed you throughout the internet. Can you explain that concept here?
Our CTO at The Onion is really passionate about kind of finding like-minded entities and names and brands and recreating. And I think this is going to be a big part of the federated space. Is recreating what was in the early 2000s web rings, right? Just making sure that we see so many recommendations are such a powerful thing, and seeing these kind of like-minded brands, communities, kind of create web rings that travel through the various federated spaces.
I think web rings is maybe a great segue to you, Andy. It seems like Mastodon is a network of web rings. How would you describe the Mastodon community?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The web rings is one I'm going to put a pin in because I think that's a really interesting area historically. Mastodon, I think of, and the Fediverse generally, because Mastodon is not the Fediverse. I hasten to make clear for people who are watching the recording who are saying this guy's from Mastodon and he's representing the Fediverse. It's a series of communities. There's lots of different servers, and those servers have different personalities. And I think that is, to your point, Leila, where you can start your own, if you want to, community, Mastodon instance, Mastodon server for a specific community. There's one for historians, historians.social. My degree is in history. I'm not on that instance, but there is a topic-based server for people who are interested in history. There is one which is more close to my interest with 3D printing, 3dp.chat, so 3D printing folks. But again, those communities, you can join one of those servers and be part of that community that is a local to that server. But Mastodon, the Fediverse as a whole, is a community of communities. And because of, in our case, ActivityPub, in Bluesky's case, AT Proto, because of the underlying system, you can talk to people anywhere, regardless of their topic interest, their geography. So things like hashtags then become very powerful for seeing where the conversations are, who's talking about particular topics, such as hashtag Fediverse House. I've been following that hashtag for the last 2 days while I've been here, seeing who's talking about it across different Mastodon servers or Fediverse instances, and engaging with them. So I think the way that I see it, you can then you can relate that to web rings if you like. You can create pointers to different communities of folks that exist in different places. The thing that I wanted to say about web rings is, I know that you're interested in music, Mira, and so am I. And one of the cool things about indie music on the Fediverse right now is that there's this real explosion of interest in creating services to help indie musicians sort of take back some power from some of the places where they found themselves unable to connect directly with their fans anymore because it's been commoditized. And so, for example, there's a piece of software called Faircamp, which they have a web ring of Faircamp instances that's not currently federated, but it lets the musicians sort of stand up their own website. This comes back to the conversation we were having in the developer meetup here yesterday about this technical concept called Posse, post on your own site and syndicate everywhere. So I'm seeing the resurgence of web rings as well. 20 years later, it's really interesting.
Rose, when Paul was here yesterday, so Paul Frazee was here yesterday, the CTO of Bluesky, he was talking about AT protocol as something that was built for scale. When you think about community on Bluesky and you think about scale, how do you help people feel that it's their home where they can find their people there?
Yeah, I think that communities need curation, and we oftentimes at Bluesky talk about cozy corners, where we learn a lot from what happens in the real world and offline, which is, it's kind of crazy thinking about going on Twitter and going onboarding by yourself, enjoying this big open town square where you're kind of just shouting at people or meeting people in a really, really uncomfortable way. In the real world, you would never go to a party by yourself. It's like very awkward. And so I think what we think about is communities are in some ways like a bridge. You feel more comfortable with people who are more like-minded. How can we enable people to find those folks more easily with our starter pack feature, for example? They can then onboard into a cozy corner of Bluesky, which is one of the feeds or the community spaces that is a feed right now, but we might do something else. And so what we found is then once people actually find more connections in these cozier corners, they're more likely to explore other corners and go and speak and learn from a more global feed. And so we see communities as just bridges between all the different topics and interests that people have. And then in the future, it's how do we connect all these different communities?
Andy, I think the experience of a new user maybe coming to Mastodon might be like a person going alone to a party and they're like, who do I talk to? So how would you recommend people onboard into Mastodon if they don't know where to start?
Yes. So yesterday here in the Fediverse House, people were talking a little bit about the older user experience where you came along and you were immediately confronted with this list of servers or asked, well, where do you want to start? Which is confusing, how it was confusing. So initially, as a stepping stone, we sort of moved it towards we'll give you a default home if you're not sure where to start. And then my suggestion, and the thing that I found most powerful is following hashtags as well as people. So you may be able to find a couple of people that you already know, but follow hashtags that reflect your interests. You can put those on your profile. There's a social experience where people start to post a hashtag introduction post and they can pin that to their profile to say, here I am. Some folks will then pick up on hashtag introduction posts and welcome folks. Fingers crossed they're making those welcoming posts. And that's a good way to start out, I find. There's a bunch of useful third-party tools. I think the nice thing about the current crop of networks across the Fediverse and AT Proto is that anybody can build on those. So people have built some really nice things that do things like lists. There's some Fediverse kind of analogs to starter packs, which are a brilliant idea that Bluesky had. Those have been also really useful to find community, I think, and to build those kind of connections. And I think all of this, and this came up in the opening talk here this morning, is about authentic connection between people. And it needs to be, you need to put in the effort to interact with humans, because we're humans. That's where we get value in our lives. That's why I love to come to an event and actually meet people in person. I mean, I love the onlines, and I've had tons of value from that in my life, but it changes the dynamic to have those in-person interactions. But if you're not interacting, if you're just scrolling the feed, looking for something that interests you, you might find something, but it becomes more meaningful as soon as you start interacting and having respectful conversations.
Right. Leila, how do you choose which platform or which Fediverse service you choose to engage with for which brand that you're managing?
Well, I mean, and I think you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, is that in the Onion's trajectory, right? Like in particular, the Onion. The Onion despite the fact that it has this kind of like classic reference of like news, has always been kind of very experimental and very first to market when it comes to joining and experimenting with digital spaces. So the Onion was really early to Twitter, which makes sense because it is so text-based, right? Like you can digest an Onion article really, really easily in a tweet. So obviously it made a lot of sense for us to move to Bluesky. And, we just found a really hungry space there. And a lot of people who were interested in that kind of former experience of like sharing and engaging and like being under a post and tagging people in, that was very familiar to them, but didn't have, like a ton of Nazis running around. The thing is, and, to your credit, like Mastodon's not perhaps like not super welcoming to brands at this point. And I think that's a great thing, right? Like that lends itself to community, but the Onion has like a strange, and a lot of the places I've mentioned have this strange, like kind of a brand, kind of a voice, but does not actually like the Onion does not actually engage with its audience. It kind of lets its audience exist underneath itself. But to look at like a place like Flaming Hydra, which is very much interested in sharing writing and sharing art and sharing perspectives from many different voices, it's had a lot of success there at a place like Mastodon. But to answer your question, I really think that the community kind of speaks for itself, right? Like, where are you getting engaged? Where are you getting people, really excited to be a part of whatever it is you're sharing?
How do you all think the hashtag fits in terms of being a magnet for community? Like Mastodon has some great hashtags. Believe in a Film is an excellent one if you're into analog photography. How do you think about that mechanism as a magnet for community?
Shout out to Chris Messina, who's not necessarily in the room, but created the hashtag. It's fantastic. I think, I follow far too many probably and I get a ton of useful information in there. I guess there's an element, especially for newcomers, of understanding what it is. I think it's become such a cultural thing now that you see it in advertising on billboards all the time, that I think people do understand the notion of a hashtag or the notion of a topic label, and it's built right in to most. I can't think of many, if any, Fediverse platforms that don't have some level of hashtag, direct clickable support or aggregation of that content. One of the things to the point around brands and so on, and the potential negative response in the Fediverse is that there's also been, to date, a somewhat sensitive response to things like global search. And I think the ability for hashtags to help to aggregate content together has been very valuable in that context. We're looking at ways to go up to a new level of discovery with a project that Mastodon started called Fediscovery that the EU is helping to fund, which will hopefully enable a bit better global or more overall discovery across different types of service in the Fediverse. But for now, hashtags are really, really central. So definitely, if you're new to the spaces, definitely check those out. I think that's a really useful way of bringing communities together.
Does Bluesky have hashtags?
Great question. Yeah, we do have hashtags. Hashtags are a great tool for discovery and aggregation. And so very important for communities. And it depends on the culture. So in Japan, we have a ton of Japanese users on Bluesky. In fact, when we first opened to the public, February of last year, that week we had 1 million Japanese users join. And so Japanese society is actually very much organized around hashtags. On the news, they have a hashtag. Everyone's jumping on there to talk on Twitter, whatever sports games. And so to not have it when we were trying to serve a global audience, I think would be wrong. But at the same time, I think there's some things lacking with hashtags. You can't sort hashtags, hottest or latest very well. If you misspell hashtags, it doesn't get in there. It's also, hashtags means intent, right? So people who use the hashtags will get in there, but there's many people who don't use hashtags. And so when Netflix, for example, had Squid Games 2 come out, season 2, they started a feed on Bluesky that was not hashtag based, but more just like keywords, anybody talking about Squid Games got just put into that feed. And so the way that we think about it is we've provided a toolbox for the community builders. You can use hashtags, you can use feeds. There's lots of different ways for discovery and aggregation, and we're leaving it to you to choose, and then we'll showcase what other communities are doing.
I'd love to talk now about moderation, because that's, if you're a community builder, you obviously want to create a safe, welcoming space for your tribe. So decentralized moderation is super exciting because, no one company is setting the rules. And it's kind of a way to scale eyes and ears out there. But it's also a little bit scary because you're like leaving the super important thing into the hands of your community. And yet we've seen a tremendously successful model of that in Reddit. How do you guys feel about this form of governance as a way forward?
Well, one of the things about Reddit that I think is really important is that there is a sort of sense of pride in being a moderator. And it kind of reminds me a little bit, I keep making these like 20-year-old references, but it reminds me of those, old message boards, right? Where you the bulletin-based message boards where you had very visible moderators. When you make a moderator feel like their work is important and that they belong to the community that they're invested in, you have a more successful moderation experience. I do think, in general, I think people tend, I can't really think of any instances of people leaving a platform because it was over-moderated, but I certainly can think of many of people leaving platforms because it's under-moderated, which is, I think, an important part of community building. But yeah, I think that recognizing the people who are doing that work and finding ways to acknowledge the usually unpaid labor that they're doing because they care a lot about that community is a really important part of keeping moderated spaces useful.
Andy, because Mastodon has, all these sort of independently run servers with their own moderators, how do you help moderators be equipped for the job?
Yeah, to Leila's point, I think, first of all, shout out to everybody who helps to moderate online spaces because it's super complicated and humans are messy. So we've been very fortunate for the last couple of years that there's been an organization in the Fediverse that's been working on building structures. It's called IFTAS, Independent Federated Trust and Safety. It's in the process of winding down. But what they are leaving behind is a really good set of fundamental documentation, instructions, support for people who are in those kind of roles to, learn some of the skills that they may not have known that they needed, particularly around some of the legislation, regulation that exists in the space. I think one of the nice things about the Fediverse and ActivityPub services is that one size has not fitted all over the last 20 years in social media. We found that a lot of the big platforms haven't been able to easily navigate the nuances of human existence and behavior in different regions. So it is, I think, a strength that you can join a server where your identity is respected. Your local moderators, your instance owner, your server owner may understand you much more than the much broader global community. So that's a strength. But there's work involved, right? There's humans involved in this whole loop, and I just have the utmost gratitude for people that take on those roles because they're the most important people in the community in terms of helping to understand what the personality of a community is and how to protect that. Because a lot of folks out there require a lot of protection. The Fediverse in particular was built by folks who were othered by big tech, who are from the trans and non-binary communities, and I think those folks have built safe spaces and want that culture to be protected, and I think that's really important.
Rose, now Bluesky has a multi-layered, user-centric moderation system, and there's one thing I'd love for you to maybe start with is just one component, but called stackable moderation services. What is that and how does that work?
Well, I love that you use the word governance when you ask the question, because that's how we see moderation. It's essentially, how do we protect people? And in the real world, there's court systems, there's police force, there's not one tool to go and keep us safe. And when I think about moderation in terms of stackable, an analogy could be like a court system, where currently on other platforms today, if you want something changed or you're upset with something, it's like you have to go to the Supreme Court. That's actually the only layer. And you have to go petition them to go and pay attention to the issue that you care about. It's really hard to get anything done, right? Yes, it's efficient because it's centralized, but also so many diverse communities, as you mentioned, Andy, don't get prioritized. And so when we think about stackable moderation, we kind of think about it as different layers of the court system. So when you enter Bluesky, our server, our society is governed by our terms of service and community guidelines. And in here, we guard against intolerance, hate speech, misinformation. But then there's a lot between intolerance and people having a bad time. And so what we wanted to do is basically give people the option of creating basically lower courts where they can adjudicate those issues. So for example, if you don't want to see US politics, rather than just, threads, just turn it on or off for the entire network, you can go and use a labeler that hides or warns you if there's US political content built by another user. Now, if that label violates our terms of service or community guidelines, that's when Aaron Rodericks, our head of trust and safety, who used to be the head of election integrity at Twitter, he will come in with his team to make sure that we then help that lower court or that labeler either comply or then we'll shut it down. And so that's the different layers. And then, of course, once you leave our society, Bluesky, then you can set up your own court system. And then it's just kind of up to us if we want to connect with you or not.
So what metrics or what signals do you look at today to say my community is healthy, it's humming, it's growing, from both the platform and the brand side?
Metrics is my enemy. I've been in developer relations for a long time, and that's humans are spongy, and metrics are really, it's all about, measuring numbers, and I find that really, really tricky to answer. And so I'm going to answer it by talking about vibes, which is probably not fantastic, but I think that certainly, look, you can look at numbers of users on an instance and a number of active users on an instance. But I think it's also going back to my earlier point about human engagement and those conversations that happen. And those are things that you can recognize by visually or by being part of the community, but they're a little less easy to measure, to track. The Fediverse, generally speaking, and Mastodon specifically, tries to track as little as possible. Which is challenging if you're a brand, because brands want to know impressions and numbers and audience and all those things. So I find that a tricky bridge to cross. I don't really understand too well how we can make that easier at the moment. Because as somebody who cares about user data and privacy and owning my own content, I don't necessarily want all of that information to be tracked. So I think from a community health perspective, I think you can see when there's a decent volume of respectful engagement on topics. And I think then you need to be actively engaged in that moderation thing that we've just talked about. That's also tricky, to make sure that those conversations stay healthy and don't go wildly off track. I'm gonna dodge the metrics question.
I mean, I have two answers to that. The first, kind of to your point, is that one of the things from a user community brand standpoint, we are, I think, moving away from more traditional metrics like engagement and impressions. I think what's more interesting instead is patterns. And I think that, that's something that we talked a lot about at Netflix, is that what were your watch habits, right? Like, there's a very different experience for people consuming one kind of content and then going to, like, I don't know, a sitcom, than the same kind of content and going to, like, a niche anime, right? Like, you can make really different assumptions about those two different paths. And I think that, to me, that's where metrics, I think, should go. Like, the people who like this might also like this kind of thing. The people who like this community or this feed might also like that kind of community and that feed. And that's a type of insight not a lot of platforms drill down on. And I think is one that's really valuable for community building. The second thing, and a little more forthright, is that, I've been here, I've talked about social media at South by Southwest now for over 11 years. My first time talking about it here was about Facebook in 2014. One of the things we talked about and thought about from, like, a community building perspective is the concept that we owned our followers. Like, once you get your followers, like, you get somebody who's opting in. And that is just not true anymore. Our biggest platform, our biggest group of followers right now is on Twitter X, Twitter. That is a completely disengaged audience. They are, we don't see the same kind of engagement that we do in our community that is 1/10 the size on Bluesky. And so I think that people have let the algorithm kind of, for better or for worse, determine their experience. Now, of course, in a decentralized world, you get to pick your algorithm. But I think that has the concept of like followers, people opting in is like just so different and not as crucial of a metric now.
I've heard that again and again, that the Fediverse has much better engagement. You get much higher quality audiences. But, Rose, I'll let you answer the metrics question.
Will I? I think there's like the very typical metrics that you want to look at of like, oh, do people come back from the same, group? But one of the things I think that's hard with metrics is community is kind of a catch-all phrase. Like, it's a group, what's the difference between a fandom and a community and a group of people? I think it's really unclear. And what we've seen on Bluesky is these different communities actually have very different intents. So take, for example, the kidlit community, kid literature. So this is all started by a couple illustrators. The art director at Scholastic has been a stronghold there. And, they're growing pretty, like a couple hundred a month. But they've been steady and super excited about the growth that they're seeing. And they're not trying to do a big scale. They love the community that they're slowly growing. Then we have sports on Bluesky that actually all started with a few wrestlers that we gave invite codes to about 1.5 years ago. And they were just such strong supporters of Bluesky that they started pulling in other sports folks. And now we have NFL, NBA, MLB, like it's huge now. And it all came from a few folks. And so I think what we've learned about healthy communities is one, I think it's all about strong ties between the first group of people or like some groups of people who really, really care about it. If you don't have those people who want to put in the work, who care deeply about this community and have strong ties with a couple other people in that community, I think it's going to be really hard for that community to grow in a healthy way. And then I think there's another piece of communities around just, you kind of know it when you see it, when it's working. Like you don't have to put a metric on it. And so for those, like the science community on Bluesky has just exploded. And that was actually between like one engineer and one scientist who built the feed and just slowly got people to come on. And now I think Nature did a survey of their their readers, and like 70% of their readers are on Bluesky, which is so exciting. And I'm so excited I got onto Nature before my parents did, who are scientists. So I was like, haha. But in general, I do think that if you really it's about focusing on the key communities that are already growing and enabling them. And those are great stories to bring to other community leaders rather than trying to do like everything breadth. I think Threads tried to do that and it didn't go over as well. They didn't get those strong ties.
Because we have a captive audience here with developers in it, and you've got people from the platforms themselves who could really hear you, what are some of the ways the social web falls short for you in terms of a community builder, and what can they do to make that job easier?
Oh, gosh. We talked about moderation, right? Like giving an opportunity to recognize moderation when it's happening correctly, right? I think I sit on a cap table of a streaming service that is not a part of, is aiming to, or by streaming I mean like a streamer, like gaming. And they're aiming to be like a much more moderated, decentralized version of Twitch. It's called Moonbeam. And one of the things that they aim to do and is really exciting is they have a whole mechanism that is based on the type of moderation you want and how you can delineate and demark your feed your feed income to moderators. So you can give 100% of your income to the moderator, or like 1%, right? And like, obviously you're going to get different quality moderators for that. And I just thought that was a really interesting way. Obviously feeds or streamers are very different, than, you know, a platform like that. But I think that recognizing the members of the community that are committed to your community is just so important. And, you know, I think to your point, Rose, a strong community has these kind of centralized forces. And how are you able to engage with them as a creator brand outside of a like or a follow, right? Like we've really created this binary that's like not super flexible. Whereas if somebody says something to you in person that that you like, there's so many different ways to reward that.
Totally.
And I think that is something that we have an opportunity to kind of rethink. And with that in mind, I think that you know, continuing to recognize those who are putting in the good work for your community, both in terms of like using that kind of governance, and then just like vibes, like people who are bringing the vibes, you know, sometimes you just have, you know, there's very few other ways to encapsulate that. For instance, when Drill joined Bluesky, it was like a signal.
It was.
Like the community has arrived. And like, how do you recognize something like that? With him, it's obviously difficult, but like, how do you recognize that kind of presence when it's so important to feeling like your community is thriving?
I have one more question before we open up to the audience. But what advice would you have for community builders who are coming to the social web for the first time? What should they do?
I think Peter said on the last panel, just get involved, right? Get an account, start interacting. Doesn't really matter to an extent. I'd like you to come to ActivityPub, but I'm on Bluesky as well. So, you know, I think there's going to be a ton of platforms. Try them out, see what works, figure out where your tribe is, engage with people. I think those are, and yeah, you need to engage. You can't just show up, wait for something to happen, assume that everybody's going to follow you. It's about human connection, right? ActivityPub in particular is built around, you know, people, things, and actions, right? Activities, interactions. That's core to the whole thing. So I think really just get involved on the new platforms. If you're on some of the centralized existing big tech, whatever you want to call them, platforms, create accounts on the new ones or the ones that you haven't tried yet. Check them out. Interact with people. Don't just create an account and then wait for something to happen. Do something yourself. Take part. That's my advice.
One of my favorite things about community leaders is also how much they want to interact with other community folks. And one of the things on Reddit, for example, is most of the moderators will share notes about what's working or not working. Same thing with ActivityPub. A lot of the different server heads and moderators are sharing tips all the time. And so I think so much of this is like, don't do it alone. People have been doing this, like go learn from them. But also I think for us, it's about, okay, there are different entry points and we want people to try different things. So whether that's like creating a different feed or creating a starter pack where you can put together a list of followers or feeds to have people follow, I think it's just like experiment. If it doesn't work, make another one.
I'm going to say something kind of marketing-y, and it feels a little bit to me like a no-brainer, which is that it's 2025, the monoculture is dead, right? Like the concept that one space and one vision is like definitive is, you know, was destroyed in the last 5 to 10 years. And because of that, we need to stop thinking about scale. As things become more and more federated and more decentralized, it becomes so much less about scale. Like, we don't want to be Mr. Beast. right? Like, we don't want to be this kind of meaningless, giant conglomerate that doesn't have kinds of connections with various places and various people. I just think that the concept of like growing at scale feels just like so 2015 to me, and like growing with purpose is like a little more is a little more meaningful, right? And like, where are you finding that growth? You're not just trying to get like nameless followers to come to your Instagram anymore, you know?
I think it's a great place to open it up for questions.
Thank you. Damon here, Blue Sky user 3,700. But two questions. Getting on with vibes, right? One of the things that I really appreciated early about the Blue Sky team was having the opportunity to communicate, right? Like, and set the foundation. And I think a lot of that gets missed when people ask, like, why did they go with creating their own protocol as opposed to using ActivityPub, right? Like, you have the opportunity to set a foundation in terms of what the expectations are and setting culture, right? And so my question to you is, like, how fundamental was that in those comms and having communications like, hey, we want to say, you know, these are the expectations, this is what we're building. And it was very out in the public, right? And you know, Paul became a rock star because of it, right? And so that's the first question. The second question would be for everyone is we discussed about scale. I think scale shouldn't be ignored, though, because I think there's an opportunity for big world and small world, right? Especially when you consider events, global events, right? You know, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. And I think I don't want that to get lost in the decentralized conversation, because those were global events that shape and impact the world, right? And so I think we still need that big world scale, because I don't want us to ever get into an opportunity where we're like limiting the reach of those events, because those are things that need to be discussed and addressed.
Thank you, Damon. I'll start with the question around Paul, our rockstar CTO. I do think that for Blue Sky, we started with very little money, and we're a tiny startup of 20 people still today. And so we didn't spend any marketing dollars up front. It was just us using the app to just kind of showcase what the reference client app could do for the app protocol. We initially built the Blue Sky app as a reference client so that other devs would build other apps and clients on top of the app protocol. Because it's really hard to bet on a go-to-market strategy of, oh, we're going to go viral. And thus this is the way we're going to go forward. It just so happened, though, that Blue Sky is starting to reach some level of scale. And I completely agree with you that you don't have to choose between the big world, small world experience. It's actually very much the vision of Blue Sky is maybe in the morning, I just want to hang out with my cat feed friends. But then later I want to go check out what's happening in the news. But maybe that's not the first thing I want to do in the morning. And so you should be able to have that option as a user. But I think at the end of the day, as we're talking about, you know, communities, and how you need that strong central force, I think that's very much the Blue Sky team is, Blue Sky, the app protocol, the larger ecosystem is in some ways a manifestation of our team. Like what we believe in, how we engage with the community, we're setting some ways like these like vibes that people pick up on. And I think it's what brings people either here or not. A lot of it doesn't have to be explicit. And so that's in some ways, I think, something we want to keep going with, but also like we've heard so many other users tell us that like they came to Blue Sky because they felt like they were talking to real people. And I think that's what we're really hungry for, is real people, real information.
Shall I pick up on the second part? Or first of all, I want to say I think my observation of the Blue Sky team is been that they've been great at that, absolutely great at that. I think that sense of accessibility is really valuable, and I've really enjoyed meeting you and Paul and others in the course of the last few days and over time. So I think the question around global movements versus smaller communities, perhaps, is really important. And I think one of the interesting elements is both of the two movements you mentioned, coincidentally, manifested through hashtags. So I think the accidental but global power of the hashtag is really valuable here. So I equally don't want to be caught in filter bubbles that are just comfortable for me as a middle-class white guy that doesn't want to, notionally might not want to hear about things that are troubling to me, right? But actually, no, I live in the real world. I want to engage with the world. So I could, as somebody who chooses a smaller community, avoid things I'm not comfortable with, right? I personally choose to try to expand my perspectives. That's a challenge. So that's the challenge, is how we continue that conversation and creating these global conversations around things like that. And I think hashtags in particular have been incredibly powerful. And going back to that conversation we had earlier in the discussion today, I think those have the power to transfer between networks, between communities, and we should be encouraging those conversations to happen. I don't have a definitive answer to your question, but I think that's a really valuable part of it.
Yeah, and I think you brought up that's a really, really strong, valid point, that these movements we need to have space for them. To be clear, I was kind of talking about, the creator perspective of growing at all cost, right? That your following and your scale is the number one metric. We want our content to be seen by as many people as possible. And when you are able to create content that transcends just your community, that's a huge win, right? And when you're able to have a conversation that transcends your community or is parsed by your community and interpreted by your community, I think those are really also important signals. But yeah, I think that, those movements need to be less top down. Well, you named two movements that were really bottom up. But culture has, for the last 50, 60 years, has been really top down. And that is where if you have scale, you can conduct that top down experience. And I think, we're moving away from that, where you have good content, you can build a bottom up experience.
Hi, I have a question for Rose. So you mentioned the moderation as kind of a stack of court systems, and how, anybody can create a community and be their own lower court. Is that to imply that Bluesky, the company, is sort of the supreme court of this moderation stack and ultimately has the final say over what does and doesn't get removed?
Great question. Let me clarify. So just like on ActivityPub, people can start up different servers. On Bluesky, we're the largest city right now. So many people live in the Bluesky society, and that's on our server. But if you choose to go to a different server, they can set their own Supreme Court rules in their own society. And so what we see is, okay, let's have all these different societies being built, and we should build the plumbing and then the bridges between them. And so there are other cities that we'll trade with and, have friendly relations with, but then maybe there are some who really go against our terms of service. And we choose not to connect with them. And so ultimately, I think we see it as we need these flexible systems. We still believe in free speech. There will be people who believe in things that we don't believe in. And it is a limit of reach that maybe they can't connect with the Bluesky server, and that's okay. But then in terms of how the Bluesky society works, it's very much when you enter our society, yes, we do have a court system that doesn't tolerate hate speech or misinformation. But if these lower courts, the other thing we've learned is that essentially they aren't just per feed, like it is in subreddit, where it's you can only moderate that subreddit manually, and those tools don't transfer. And so we wanted to give community leaders that tool to then be able to use, any community leader can say, I'm going to use that spam filter, or I'm going to use that rude filter, and you don't have to build it from the ground back up because somebody else has already built it.
Great. Hi. So one of the powerhouses of community is Facebook groups, which are private communities that are built into that platform. I think that we see the same kind of private communities replicated in chat systems like Discord or Telegram groups. Notably, none of the current Fediverse systems like Mastodon or Bluesky support private groups. What importance do private groups have for community going forward?
Doesn't Friendica support private groups?
That's Friendica.
Yeah, that's just Friendica. They do everything.
But it's in Fediverse, so none of the current. Anyway, I sense a challenging question here from Mr. Rod.
Just is it important?
Yes,
do we need it?
I get that, and I think that particularly things like Discord and Telegram are challenging themselves for different reasons, and especially with the real-time nature of the chat and the inability to potentially go back and see previous content and so on. I think there is a huge amount of value in private groups, and I think there are movements or suggestions, Fediverse enhancement proposals to add groups and so on to ActivityPub applications. I think the ability, if I use myself as an example, which is not a great example because I'm one human.
We could use Mastodon. Mastodon uses a private Discord for its development team.
Correct, absolutely. Yeah, we use Discord as our internal chat tool. So, I mean, I think that there's, of course, private spaces. And then we come down to somebody I think was going to be working on end-to-end encryption for messages in ActivityPub as well. So so I think there's definitely levels of interaction that can be added to enhance the experience here.
At Bluesky, we absolutely believe in private state and private profiles down the line. When we built the protocol, we built it to be open. We're only a year old. It's kind of crazy to me too. And so it's just, we're working on it. It's going to take some time, but that's something that we very much care about.
Hi, thank you all. First, I went to a Creative Commons space, and Audrey Tang brought up something I thought was really interesting, which is moderating up. A lot of the moderation you've talked about is kind of like this, don't do that. You know, it's like the user is a screaming child in a supermarket, and we are training them. This is not the place to do that. Do you have any examples or any future-looking features where we could, curb extremism, promote, healthy discourse through like positive actions of moderation?
Well, I think about this a lot in terms of most of the ways you can express dissent about a post or somebody is to continue to propagate it up. Right? Like you quote post them, you repost, or, and so what we've thought about at Bluesky is like, what are the product mechanisms that we can put in place that actually starts discouraging that behavior? And so one of the things that we've done is you can separate out quote posts from the original post. And so then you're not continuously propagating that same message. Something else we've thought about is, don't hold me to this, we're still working it out, but like downvotes, for example, that aren't viewable, but in some ways are expressing, hey, this content is really horrible. And so over time, if that gets super downranked, maybe the algorithm won't pick it up or other feeds will choose to use that content a different way. And so what we want to do is empower users and give them more tools to help self-regulate each other.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you.